It all started with the sound of a car horn blaring so loudly that it could have woken the dead, or at least my neighbor's perpetually napping golden retriever. I bolted upright from my chair by the window, coffee mug in hand, spilling a little bit of that sweet caffeine nectar onto my pajama pants. It was Saturday morning, and I was supposed to be enjoying the kind of peace and quiet that suburban life promises but rarely delivers. Instead, what greeted me outside was chaos. There it was, a black SUV, parked diagonally across my driveway like it had been dropped from the sky by some vengeful parking god. Not just blocking my car in, oh no, that would be far too ordinary. This monstrosity was practically doing yoga on my property. Its front wheels tilted slightly onto my lawn, while the back end jutted out into the street. It wasn't just bad parking. It was an act of war. I stormed out of the house, still clutching my coffee mug like it was a weapon. And there he stood, Clipboard Carl. That's what I've decided to call him because, well, he had a clipboard and a face that radiated smugness so intense it could power a small city. He was dressed in khakis so stiff they looked like they'd been starched by NASA, and a polo shirt tucked in so tightly it seemed to be holding him together. "Good morning," he chirped in a tone that suggested it wasn't going to be a good morning for me. "Is this your car?" I asked, gesturing toward the SUV with my free hand while trying not to spill more coffee on myself. "Yes," he said, as if I just asked him whether the sky was blue. "I'm with the HOA. Now, if you've ever lived in an HOA-governed neighborhood, you know exactly what those three letters mean: Homeowners Association. The overlords of suburbia, the enforcers of mailbox uniformity and lawn conformity. But here's the thing, this guy didn't look like an HOA official. He didn't have a badge or any sort of identification, just that clipboard and an aura of unwarranted authority. "I'm here to enforce parking regulations," he continued, flipping through some papers on his clipboard like he was about to cite me for crimes against asphalt. I blinked at him. "Parking regulations? My car is parked in my driveway." "Yes," Carl said slowly, as if explaining quantum physics to a toddler, "but your driveway is too close to the street." Now let me pause here for a second because this is where things went from annoying to absolutely absurd. There is no such rule in our HOA bylaws about driveways being too close to anything. Driveways are literally designed to connect your house to the street. That's their whole purpose. But Clipboard Carl clearly thought he was Judge Judy and executioner rolled into one. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the rising tide of rage bubbling inside me. "I don't know who you think you are or what authority you think you have, but you need to move your car right now." Carl smirked, a smirk so infuriating it should be classified as a crime against humanity. "I'm afraid I can't do that," he said. "You're in violation of HOA regulations." At this point, I was torn between laughing at how ridiculous this was and screaming into the void. Instead, I took a deep breath and tried reasoning with him one more time. "Okay," I said slowly, "can you show me where in the HOA bylaws it says anything about driveways being too close to the street?" Carl hesitated for just a fraction of a second before flipping through his clipboard again. He muttered something about proximity rules and community standards, but it was clear he had no idea what he was talking about. Meanwhile, a few neighbors had started gathering nearby, drawn by the commotion like moths to a flame. One woman even brought out her lawn chair and sat down with her morning tea as if she were watching live theater. Carl noticed the growing audience and puffed out his chest like some kind of suburban peacock. "If you don't comply," he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I'll have no choice but to escalate this matter." "Escalate," I repeated incredulously. "You're already parked illegally on MY property. What are you going to do? Fine yourself." The crowd chuckled, but Carl wasn't deterred. He pulled out his phone and started typing furiously, probably texting his imaginary HOA colleagues for backup. At this point, I realized two things. One, this guy wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. And two, I needed reinforcements of my own. That's when my sister Emily arrived on the scene. Now Emily isn't just my sister. She's also a lawyer with zero tolerance for nonsense. She walked up with her usual air of calm authority and took one look at Carl before turning to me. "What's going on here?" she asked. "This guy claims he's with the HOA," I explained, gesturing toward Carl and his ridiculous clipboard. Emily raised an eyebrow and turned her attention to Carl. "And what exactly are you enforcing?" Carl opened his mouth to respond but quickly closed it again when Emily pulled out her phone. Not for social media or selfies, but for something far more powerful. The digital copy of our HOA bylaws. "Let's see," she said as she scrolled through the document with practiced ease. "Nope. Nothing here about driveway proximity rules." Carl's face turned redder than a stop sign as Emily continued reading aloud from the bylaws for everyone to hear. "And actually," she added with a smirk that rivaled Carl's earlier one, "blocking someone else's driveway is considered trespassing under local law." The crowd erupted into laughter while Carl stammered and fumbled with his clipboard like it might somehow save him from this public humiliation. As for me, well, let's just say watching Emily verbally dismantle clipboard Carl was better than any Netflix drama I'd ever seen, and we were only getting started. Emily didn't even wait for Carl to recover from the verbal smackdown she'd just delivered. She turned to me and said, "Jack, can you believe this guy? He's like a bad episode of Cops, but with less action and more khakis." Carl, clearly flustered, tried to regain control of the situation. He straightened his clipboard like it was some kind of magical shield and cleared his throat. "I don't think you understand," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "I'm here to uphold the standards of this community. If we let people like him," he jabbed a finger in my direction, "just park wherever they want, what's next? Lawns with weeds? Mailboxes that don't match? Chaos." Emily looked at him like he'd just suggested we replace all the neighborhood trees with inflatable palm trees. "Are you seriously comparing parking in your own driveway to the fall of civilization?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. "Because if so, I think you might need to reevaluate your priorities." The crowd was loving this. A few neighbors had pulled out their phones and were recording the whole thing, probably for their HOA Facebook group or maybe just for their own entertainment. One guy even shouted, "Get him, Emily!" which earned him a glare from Carl and a thumbs up from my sister. Carl wasn't giving up, though. Oh no, this man was committed to his role as the self-appointed enforcer of suburban order. He flipped through his clipboard again and said, "I don't think you realize how serious this is. The HOA has very clear rules about maintaining the aesthetic integrity of our neighborhood." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Aesthetic integrity?" she repeated, as though he'd just told her the moon was made of cheese. "Yes," Carl said firmly, "and parking too close to the street disrupts that integrity." At this point, I couldn't hold back anymore. "Carl," I said, trying not to laugh, "you're parked diagonally across my driveway. If anyone's disrupting the aesthetic integrity of this neighborhood, it's you." The crowd erupted into laughter again, and Carl's face turned an even deeper shade of red. He looked like a tomato that had been left out in the sun too long. But Carl wasn't done yet. Oh no, he had one last card to play, or so he thought. He pulled out a laminated sheet of paper from his clipboard and held it up like it was the Declaration of Independence. "This," he announced dramatically, "is a copy of the HOA's parking guidelines." Emily snatched it out of his hand before he could say another word. She scanned it quickly and then burst out laughing. A full-on belly laugh that made even more neighbors come out to see what was going on. "What's so funny?" Carl demanded, looking genuinely offended. "This," Emily said between laughs, holding up the laminated sheet for everyone to see, "isn't even from our HOA. This is from some random HOA in Florida." The crowd lost it at that point. People were laughing so hard they were doubling over. Even the guy with the lawn chair had tears streaming down his face. Carl snatched the paper back and looked at it closely for what was probably the first time ever. Sure enough, at the top of the page were the words, "Sunny Palms Homeowners Association, Naples, Florida." Carl stammered, clearly at a loss for words. "Let me guess," Emily said with a smirk. "You found this on Google and thought no one would notice?" Carl didn't respond. He just stood there clutching his clipboard like it was a life raft in a sea of humiliation. Meanwhile, I was starting to feel a little bad for him. Not enough to stop enjoying the show, but enough to offer him an out. "Look," I said, trying to keep my tone reasonable despite everything that had just happened. If you move your car right now and promise not to pull this stunt again, we can all forget this ever happened. But Carl wasn't ready to admit defeat. Instead of moving his car or apologizing or doing anything remotely logical, he doubled down. "I'm not going anywhere," he declared loudly enough for everyone to hear. "And if you don't comply with HOA regulations, which don't exist," Emily interjected, "then I'll have no choice but to report you," Carl finished as though she hadn't spoken. "Report me?" I repeated incredulously. "To who?" "The HOA police." Carl puffed out his chest again and said, "To the Real HOA board." At this point, Emily couldn't take it anymore. She pulled out her phone again and started typing furiously while muttering under her breath about how ridiculous this whole situation was. "What are you doing?" Carl asked nervously. "Calling someone who actually has authority around here," Emily replied without looking up. Carl paled slightly but didn't say anything else. A few minutes later, Emily hung up her phone and turned back to me with a triumphant smile on her face. "Good news," she said cheerfully. "The real HOA president is on their way over." Carl's face went from pale to green in record time. He opened his mouth as if to protest but then seemed to think better of it and closed it again. The crowd murmured excitedly as they waited for what promised to be an epic showdown between Clipboard Carl and whoever actually ran our HOA. And honestly, I couldn't wait either. The wait for the real HOA president was, without exaggeration, the most entertaining 15 minutes of my life. The crowd had grown to what could only be described as a full-blown neighborhood block party. Someone had brought out a cooler of sodas, a couple of kids were selling lemonade on the corner, and one guy was live-streaming the whole thing on social media. I overheard him saying, "This is better than reality TV. Carl's about to get roasted." Carl, meanwhile, was doing his best to maintain an air of authority, but it wasn't going well. He stood next to his SUV with his arms crossed, occasionally glancing nervously at Emily, who was now flipping through her phone like she was preparing for a courtroom battle. Every so often, he'd mutter something about community standards or respect for the rules. But no one was paying attention anymore. The crowd had turned against him, and he knew it. Finally, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb, and out stepped a woman who looked like she meant business. She was in her late 40s, impeccably dressed in a tailored blazer and heels that could probably double as weapons. Her name tag read Linda, and she carried herself with the kind of confidence that only comes from years of dealing with people like Carl. "All right," Linda said as she approached the scene, her voice calm but firm. "What's going on here?" Carl immediately perked up like a kid who thinks the principal is about to take his side in an argument. "Linda, thank goodness you're here," he said, rushing over to her. "We've got a serious violation of HOA regulations happening right here in this driveway." Linda raised an eyebrow and looked at him like he'd just told her aliens had landed on his front lawn. "A serious violation?" she repeated skeptically. "Yes," Carl said, nodding vigorously. "This man," he pointed at me, "is parked too close to the street. It's a clear breach of our community guidelines." Linda turned her gaze to me, then to my car, then back to Carl. "You mean his car? In his driveway?" Carl hesitated for just a moment before doubling down. "Exactly. It's a safety hazard and an eyesore." Linda sighed deeply, the kind of sigh that says, "I don't get paid enough for this." She looked over at Emily, who was now grinning like the cat that ate the canary. "And who are you?" Linda asked. "I'm Emily," my sister replied smoothly. "Jack's sister and legal counsel." Linda's eyes widened slightly at the mention of legal counsel, but she quickly composed herself. "All right," she said briskly. "Let's sort this out." She walked over to Carl and held out her hand. "May I see your documentation?" Carl hesitated again, this time longer than before, but eventually handed over his trusty clipboard. Linda flipped through it for about 10 seconds before letting out another sigh, this one even heavier than the last. "Carl," she said slowly, as though speaking to a particularly dim-witted child, "this is not our HOA documentation." Carl's face turned beet red. "Well, it's similar," he stammered. "No," Linda said firmly. "It's not. She turned to me and Emily and added, "I apologize for any inconvenience this has caused you." "Oh, it's been no inconvenience at all," Emily said cheerfully. "In fact, it's been quite entertaining." The crowd chuckled again, and Carl looked like he wanted to crawl under his SUV and hide. But Linda wasn't done yet. She handed Carl back his clipboard and said, "You do realize that impersonating an HOA official is against our bylaws, right?" Carl blinked at her like a deer caught in headlights. "Impersonating?" he repeated weakly. "Yes," Linda said sharply. "You're not on the HOA board. You have no authority to enforce anything." At this point, Carl looked like he might actually cry. He opened his mouth as if to protest but quickly closed it again when Linda shot him a withering glare. "And another thing," Linda continued, her tone growing even icier, "blocking someone else's driveway is not only against our bylaws. It's also illegal under local law." The crowd let out an audible gasp at that one. A few people even started whispering things like, "Oh snap," and "he's done for." Carl tried one last time to salvage what little dignity he had left. "I was just trying to maintain order in the community," he mumbled. "Well," Linda said coldly, "you've done quite enough." She turned back to me and Emily and added, "If you'd like to file a formal complaint against Mr. Johnson here." "Wait," Carl interrupted desperately. "There's no need for that. I'll move my car right now." Linda raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything as Carl scrambled into his SUV and started it up. He reversed out of my driveway so fast I half expected him to leave skid marks on the pavement. As soon as he was gone, Linda turned back to me and Emily with an apologetic smile. "Again," she said, "I'm so sorry for all of this." "No problem at all," Emily replied graciously. "But I do have one question." "What's that?" Linda asked. Emily gestured toward the crowd of neighbors who were still standing around watching the whole spectacle unfold. "Does your HOA have any rules about public gatherings? Because I think we've got ourselves a new neighborhood tradition." The crowd erupted into laughter once more as Linda shook her head in exasperation, but couldn't help cracking a small smile herself. And just like that, Clipboard Carl became the stuff of suburban legend. A cautionary tale about what happens when you mess with someone who has both common sense and access to legal expertise. As for me, well, I finally made it out of my driveway and off to my meeting, albeit about an hour late, but honestly, it was worth every second just to see Carl get taken down by my sister and an actual HOA president. And from that day forward, every time I saw Carl walking around the neighborhood with his head down and no clipboard in sight, I couldn't help but smile. Now, you'd think that would be the end of it, right? Carl humiliated, Linda laying down the law, and me finally free to live my life without worrying about rogue SUVs blocking my driveway. But no. Oh no. Carl wasn't done. Because apparently, when you're a man with a clipboard and a fragile ego, the only logical response to public embarrassment is doubling down on your nonsense. It started a few days later. I was pulling into my driveway after work, still riding the high of watching Carl get verbally dismantled in front of half the neighborhood, when I noticed something odd. There was a piece of paper taped to my front door. Now, normally, this would be cause for concern, like maybe I'd missed a package delivery or someone was warning me about a rogue raccoon in the area. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't anything normal like that. It was a letter from Carl. I pulled it off the door and unfolded it right there on my porch. It was handwritten because of course it was, with Carl's signature scrawl all over it. The gist of the letter? He was formally warning me that my trash bins were out of compliance with HOA regulations. Now, let me paint you a picture here. My trash bins were neatly tucked away on the side of my house, exactly where they were supposed to be. They weren't overflowing, they weren't blocking any sidewalks, and they certainly weren't causing any kind of aesthetic crisis for the neighborhood. But according to Carl's letter, they were visible from the street, which he claimed was a violation. I stood there on my porch, staring at this ridiculous piece of paper, and all I could think was, he's really doing this. He's really trying to start round two. I walked inside and immediately called Emily. "You're not going to believe this," I said as soon as she picked up. "Let me guess," she replied. "Carl's back at it?" "Bingo," I said, reading her the letter verbatim. Emily let out a laugh so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "Oh, this is too good," she said once she'd caught her breath. "He's trying to enforce trash bin placement now? What's next?" "Mailbox inspections." "I wouldn't put it past him," I muttered. "Well," Emily said, her tone turning serious, or as serious as she could manage while still laughing at Carl's antics. "You know what we have to do." "What's that?" I asked. "Fight fire with fire," she said simply, and that's how Operation Trash Bin began. The next morning, Emily showed up at my house armed with a stack of documents and a gleam in her eye that told me she'd been waiting for an excuse to do something like this for years. She'd spent the night digging through our HOA bylaws again and had found exactly what we needed. "Did you know," she said as she spread the papers out on my kitchen table, "that there's nothing in these bylaws about trash bins being visible from the street?" "Of course there isn't," I said. "That would make sense. But," she continued, ignoring my sarcasm, "there is a section about harassment by other residents." I raised an eyebrow. "Harassment?" "Yep," she said with a grin. "And sending bogus letters like this definitely qualifies." I couldn't help but smile back at her. "So what do we do?" Emily leaned forward like we were planning some kind of covert mission, which honestly we kind of were. "We're going to file an official complaint against Carl with the HOA board." Now, under normal circumstances, filing an HOA complaint might seem like overkill. But these weren't normal circumstances. This was war, or at least as close to war as you can get in suburbia, and Carl had fired the first shot. Over the next few days, Emily and I gathered every piece of evidence we could find. Photos of my perfectly compliant trash bins, copies of Carl's ridiculous letter, even screenshots of texts from neighbors who'd had similar run-ins with him in the past. By the time we were done, we had enough material to make Carl look like the suburban tyrant he truly was. We submitted our complaint to Linda directly, because there was no way we were letting Carl intercept it, and waited for her response. It didn't take long. A week later, Linda called me personally to let me know that our complaint had been reviewed and that action would be taken against Carl for his behavior. "What kind of action?" I asked curiously. "Well," Linda said carefully, clearly trying not to sound too gleeful about it, "let's just say he won't be bothering you or anyone else for a while." Sure enough, Carl disappeared from public view almost immediately after that phone call. No more letters taped to doors. No more SUVs parked diagonally across driveways. It was like he'd vanished into thin air, or at least retreated into his house to lick his wounds in private. The neighborhood felt lighter without him constantly patrolling around like some kind of self-appointed suburban sheriff. People started joking about how peaceful things were now that Carl had been put in his place. As for me, well, I finally got to enjoy my driveway and my trash bins in peace. But every so often, when I see Linda driving through the neighborhood or catch Emily grinning mischievously over dinner, I can't help but think back on everything that happened and laugh. Because if there's one thing this whole experience taught me, it's this: never underestimate the power of a well-timed HOA complaint, or a sister who knows her way around a legal document. For a while, life in the neighborhood was blissfully quiet. Carl had gone radio silent, and it was like the entire street was collectively exhaling after years of holding its breath. People were mowing their lawns without fear of judgment, parking their cars wherever they pleased, within reason of course, and even leaving their trash bins out an extra day without the threat of a passive-aggressive note taped to their door. It was suburban nirvana. But, as with all good things, the peace couldn't last forever. It started on a sunny Saturday morning when I was out washing my car. I just finished rinsing off the last bit of soap when I noticed a familiar figure lurking at the end of the street. It was Carl. Clipboard-less, but unmistakably Carl. He was standing there, arms crossed, staring at me like I'd personally offended him by daring to clean my car in public. I sighed and muttered to myself, "Here we go again." Sure enough, Carl started marching up the street toward me, his face set in a determined scowl. I braced myself for whatever nonsense he was about to unleash. "Good morning, Jack," he said, his tone dripping with fake politeness. "Carl," I replied flatly, "what can I do for you?" "Well," he began, rocking back on his heels like he was about to deliver some grand proclamation. "I couldn't help but notice that you're washing your car in your driveway." I stared at him for a moment, waiting for him to elaborate. When he didn't, I said, "Yeah. And, Carl continued, his voice rising slightly, "that's against HOA regulations." I couldn't help it. I burst out laughing. "Washing my car is against HOA regulations? Really? Where exactly does it say that?" Carl's face turned redder than a fire hydrant. "It's common sense," he snapped. "Water runoff can damage the street and pollute the environment." I raised an eyebrow. "Carl, I'm using biodegradable soap and a bucket of water. The only thing running off is my patience." By this point, a couple of neighbors had started peeking out their windows to see what was going on. One guy even stepped out onto his porch with a cup of coffee, clearly ready for the show. Carl noticed the growing audience and puffed out his chest like he was about to deliver a TED Talk on suburban ethics. "It's not just about you," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "It's about maintaining the integrity of our community." "Carl," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice steady despite the urge to laugh in his face again. "You don't even have a clipboard anymore. What authority do you think you have?" That seemed to deflate him slightly, but he quickly recovered. "I'm just looking out for the neighborhood," he mumbled. At that moment, Emily appeared from inside the house, holding her phone like she'd been waiting for this exact scenario to unfold. "What's going on here?" she asked innocently as she walked over. "Carl thinks washing my car is against HOA regulations," I explained. Emily's eyes lit up with that familiar mischievous gleam. "Oh, really?" she said, turning her attention to Carl. "Which regulation would that be? Because I've read through the bylaws twice now and didn't see anything about car washing." Carl opened his mouth to respond but quickly closed it again when Emily held up her phone. "Let me save you some time," she said cheerfully. "There's nothing in the bylaws about car washing." In fact, she scrolled through her phone for dramatic effect before continuing. "The only mention of water usage is related to lawn irrigation during drought conditions." The crowd watching from their windows and porches let out a collective chuckle at that one. Carl looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole, but Emily wasn't done yet. "And while we're on the subject," she added, her tone turning icy, "harassing your neighbors is explicitly prohibited under Section 4.3 of the HOA rules." Carl stammered something unintelligible before finally blurting out, "I'm not harassing anyone. I'm just trying to keep things in order." Emily raised an eyebrow and gestured toward me with her phone. "So accusing my brother of breaking non-existent rules isn't harassment?" Carl opened his mouth again but seemed to think better of it and snapped it shut. "Thought so," Emily said with a satisfied nod. At this point, Linda, the actual HOA president, arrived on the scene. Someone must have texted her about Carl's latest antics because she looked less than thrilled to be there. "What's going on now?" she asked tiredly as she approached. Emily quickly filled her in while Carl stood there looking increasingly uncomfortable. Linda sighed deeply when Emily finished speaking and turned to Carl with an expression that could have... "Carl," she said sharply, "we've talked about this. I was just..." Carl began, but Linda cut him off. "No," she said firmly. "You were just causing problems again." She turned back to me and Emily and added apologetically, "I'm so sorry about this." "It's fine," Emily said with a shrug. "Honestly, it's kind of entertaining at this point." Linda didn't look amused. She turned back to Carl and said something quietly that I couldn't hear, but whatever it was made him turn even redder than before. Without another word, Carl turned on his heel and marched back down the street toward his house. As soon as he was out of earshot, Linda shook her head and muttered under her breath, "That man is going to give me gray hair." Emily laughed and said, "If you ever need backup dealing with him again, just let us know." Linda managed a small smile before heading back to her car. And just like that, peace was restored once more, at least until Carl decided to come up with some new nonsense rule to enforce. But honestly, at this point, it felt less like an inconvenience and more like free entertainment. Because as long as Emily had her phone and her legal expertise on hand, Carl didn't stand a chance. After Carl's latest attempt at suburban vigilantism, I thought naively, I'll admit, that he might finally have learned his lesson. I mean, how many times can one person get publicly humiliated before they decide to just quietly mow their lawn and mind their own business like the rest of us? But no, this was Carl we were dealing with. And Carl was nothing if not persistent. About a week after the car washing debacle, I came home from work to find a letter in my mailbox. Now, under normal circumstances, getting mail isn't exactly a thrilling event. But when you've got a neighbor like Carl, every piece of correspondence feels like it might be the opening salvo in a new battle. Sure enough, the envelope was unmarked. No return address, no HOA logo, nothing. Just my name scrawled across the front in handwriting that looked suspiciously familiar. I opened it right there on the sidewalk because, honestly, I couldn't wait to see what nonsense Carl had cooked up this time. The letter was typed because apparently Carl had upgraded from handwritten notes, and it was formatted to look like some kind of official document. At the top, in bold letters, were the words, "Notice of Violation." Below that was a paragraph accusing me of unauthorized modifications to my property. I stared at the letter for a solid minute, trying to figure out what on earth he was talking about. Unauthorized modifications? What modifications? The only thing I'd done to my house recently was replace a broken porch light, and unless Carl had some kind of vendetta against energy-efficient LED bulbs, I couldn't imagine why that would be an issue. I walked inside and immediately called Emily. "You're not going to believe this," I said as soon as she picked up. "Let me guess," she replied. "Carl's back at it?" "Bingo," I said, reading her the letter verbatim. Emily let out a long sigh. "All right," she said after a moment. "Time to put an end to this once and for all." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I mean," she said with a grin in her voice, "we're going to make sure Carl never pulls this kind of stunt again." The next day, Emily showed up at my house with a folder full of documents and a look of determination that could have scared off even the most stubborn HOA enforcer. "Here's the plan," she said as she spread everything out on my kitchen table. "We're going to file an official harassment complaint against Carl. Not just with the HOA, but with the local authorities." "Wait," I said, blinking at her. "The local authorities?" "Yep," she said cheerfully. "Because what Carl's doing isn't just annoying, it's illegal." She went on to explain that repeatedly sending bogus violation notices and attempting to impersonate an HOA official could be considered harassment under our state's laws. And since we had plenty of evidence, letters, photos, witness statements from neighbors, we had a solid case. I'll admit, I was hesitant at first. Taking legal action against your neighbor isn't exactly something you do lightly. But then I thought about all the headaches Carl had caused, not just for me but for everyone on our street, and decided it was time to take a stand. So we filed the complaint. A few days later, Linda called me to let me know that the HOA board had received our complaint and was taking it seriously. She also mentioned that they'd contacted Carl directly and warned him that any further incidents would result in formal disciplinary action, including possible expulsion from the HOA. Now, if you've never lived in an HOA-governed neighborhood, you might not realize how big of a deal that is. Getting kicked out of an HOA doesn't mean you have to move or anything. It just means you lose your voting rights and can't serve on any committees or enforce any rules. For someone like Carl, who thrived on wielding imaginary power over his neighbors, it was basically the ultimate punishment. But we didn't stop there. Emily also followed up with the local police department to report Carl's behavior as harassment. They didn't arrest him or anything, it wasn't that serious. But they did send an officer over to have a little chat with him about respecting his neighbor's boundaries. According to one of our neighbors, who may or may not have been eavesdropping from their porch, Carl looked absolutely mortified when the officer showed up at his door. He tried to argue that he was just doing his duty as a concerned resident, but the officer wasn't having any of it. By the time all was said and done, Carl had been officially reprimanded by both the HOA and law enforcement, and let me tell you, it was glorious. The best part? The entire neighborhood found out about it almost immediately. Word spread like wildfire, probably thanks in part to that one guy who always live-streamed everything, and before long, everyone knew exactly what had happened. For weeks afterward, people kept stopping by my house to thank me and Emily for standing up to Carl. One woman even baked us cookies as a token of her appreciation. which Emily promptly confiscated because she claimed they were evidence for her case against him. They weren't. As for Carl, well, let's just say he kept a very low profile after that. No more letters taped to doors or bogus violation notices in mailboxes. No more SUVs parked diagonally across driveways or unsolicited lectures about community standards. It was like he'd finally realized that his reign of terror was over, and honestly, the neighborhood was better off for it. Looking back on everything now, I can't help but laugh at how ridiculous it all was. From Carl's clipboard antics to Emily's legal takedown strategy. But more than anything else, I'm grateful for my sister's unwavering support and sharp legal mind, for Linda's willingness to step in when things got out of hand, and for my neighbor's sense of humor throughout the whole ordeal. Because if there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that standing up for yourself and your trash bins is always worth it. Especially when you've got someone like Emily in your corner. After Carl's spectacular downfall, life in the neighborhood settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. People were smiling more, waving at each other as they walked their dogs, and chatting over fences like we were in some kind of idyllic suburban TV show. It was as if the collective weight of Carl's clipboard tyranny had been lifted, and everyone could finally breathe again. But here's the thing about suburban drama, it doesn't just disappear. It evolves. And while Carl had been effectively dethroned as the self-appointed HOA dictator, his legacy lived on in the form of jokes, memes, and yes, neighborhood gossip. One particularly creative neighbor started a tradition called Carl Bingo. It was a laminated card with squares like passive-aggressive note, SUV parked illegally, and fake HOA violation. Every time someone spotted Carl doing something ridiculous, they'd mark a square. The first person to get bingo won bragging rights and sometimes cookies from Mrs. Jenkins down the street. Emily and I became minor celebrities after our showdown with Carl. People would stop us in the grocery store or at the local coffee shop to say things like, "You're the ones who took down Carl, right?" Legends. Emily soaked it all up with her trademark smirk, while I tried to play it off like it wasn't a big deal, even though it totally was. But here's where things get interesting. About a month after Carl's reign ended, Linda, the real HOA president, approached Emily and me with an idea. She wanted to host a neighborhood meeting to address some lingering issues and rebuild trust among residents. And she wanted us to help. "Wait," I said when she brought it up. "You want us to be part of an HOA meeting? Isn't that Carl's thing?" Linda laughed. "Exactly. That's why I need you too. People actually trust you." Emily was all in from the start. "I'll draft an agenda," she said immediately, pulling out her phone like she was preparing for battle. "And maybe we can throw in a section about how not to impersonate HOA officials." Linda chuckled nervously but didn't disagree. So we helped organize the meeting. And let me tell you, it was an event. People showed up in droves, some out of genuine interest, others just for the spectacle of seeing Emily take charge again. Someone even brought snacks, because apparently every suburban meeting needs snacks. And by the time Linda called things to order, the room was buzzing with energy. The agenda covered everything from landscaping guidelines to noise complaints, but the highlight came when Emily stood up to deliver her presentation on neighborly conduct. She'd prepared slides, actual slides, with bullet points like, "Don't block driveways," and "Trash bin placement is not a crime." She even included a flowchart titled, "Is this worth starting drama over?" with two options: yes, leading to talk calmly, and no, leading to let it go. The crowd loved it. People were laughing, clapping, and nodding along like they were watching a TED Talk on suburban harmony. Even Linda looked impressed, and she'd seen Emily in action before. But then came the moment everyone had been waiting for: Carl's apology. Yes, you heard that right, Carl apologized. Now, I'll admit I was skeptical when Linda told us he'd agreed to do it. After all, this was Carl we were talking about, the man who thought trash bins were a threat to society. But there he was, standing at the front of the room with his hands clasped awkwardly in front of him. "I just want to say I'm sorry," he began hesitantly. "I realize now that I may have overstepped." The room went silent. Not out of shock, but because no one wanted to miss a single word of this historic moment. I thought I was helping, Carl continued, his voice shaky but sincere. But I see now that my actions caused more harm than good. Emily leaned over and whispered to me, "Do you think he practiced this in front of a mirror?" I stifled a laugh and shrugged. Carl wrapped up his apology by promising to step back from any unofficial enforcement activities and focus on being a better neighbor. The crowd gave him polite applause, not enthusiastic but not hostile either, and for the first time ever, I felt a tiny pang of sympathy for him. After the meeting ended, people stuck around to chat and snack on cookies. Mrs. Jenkins had outdone herself this time. Carl kept his distance but didn't leave immediately. He seemed genuinely interested in trying to make amends. As Emily and I packed up our things, Linda approached us again. "You two did great," she said warmly. "I think this is exactly what our neighborhood needed." Emily grinned. "Happy to help," she replied before turning to me with a mischievous look. "See, we're practically heroes now." I rolled my eyes but couldn't help smiling back. And that's how things ended. Not with another dramatic showdown or legal battle, but with something resembling peace. Carl faded into the background, mostly. Emily went back to her usual lawyering adventures, and I finally got to enjoy my driveway without worrying about rogue SUVs or bogus violation notices. But here's what I'll always remember. Standing up for yourself and for your neighbors is worth it every time. Whether it's calling out nonsense rules or organizing community meetings or just refusing to let someone block your driveway with their ego disguised as an SUV. It matters. So if you've ever dealt with your own version of Carl, a clipboard-wielding busybody or an overzealous HOA enforcer or just someone who loves making life harder than it needs to be, remember this, you're not alone. And sometimes all it takes is one good lawyer or sister and a little bit of courage to turn things around. Thanks for sticking around for this wild ride through suburban drama. If you enjoyed hearing about our adventures, or if you've got your own HOA horror stories, make sure to like this video, share it with your friends, leave a comment below telling me about your own experiences, and subscribe for more tales from the trenches of everyday life. Now, let's move on to the next story. It was 6:03 a.m. when the pounding on my front door began. Loud, insistent, and entirely too aggressive for someone who wasn't holding a warrant. I stumbled out of bed, still tangled in the remnants of a dream where I was arresting a gang of jewel thieves, only to find myself face to face with Richard. Yes, that Richard, the self-appointed king of our HOA, armed with a clipboard and the kind of smug grin that could curdle milk. "Good morning, Jack," he said, his tone dripping with faux politeness. "We need to talk about your truck. Now, let me paint you a picture of this truck. It's not some rusted-out eyesore parked on cinder blocks. No, it's a clean, well-maintained Ford F-150. A hard-working vehicle for a hard-working man. But according to Richard and his merry band of HOA enforcers, my truck was an affront to the delicate sensibilities of our suburban utopia. Apparently, it clashed with the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. You know, because nothing screams harmony like overpriced SUVs and perfectly trimmed hedges that look like they've been sculpted by Michelangelo himself. "Your truck is in violation of HOA regulations," Richard declared, tapping his clipboard like he was delivering the 10 Commandments. "Section 14B clearly states that all vehicles must be stored in garages unless actively in use." I blinked at him, still groggy from sleep. "Richard," I said slowly, "my garage is full. That's not my problem," he replied with a shrug so exaggerated it could have been seen from space. "Rules are rules." Now, I'm not usually one to lose my temper before coffee, but something about Richard's sanctimonious tone made my blood boil. This was the same guy who once tried to fine Mrs. Henderson for planting daisies instead of HOA-approved tulips. The same guy who sent out a 12-page memo about the proper shade of beige for exterior paint. And now he was standing on my porch, acting like my truck was single-handedly bringing down property values. "Richard," I said, crossing my arms, "do you know what I do for a living?" He squinted at me like he was trying to remember if we'd covered this in one of our painfully awkward HOA meetings. "You're in law enforcement?" "I'm the sheriff," I clarified, letting the word hang in the air for dramatic effect. "As in, I enforce actual laws. Not whatever nonsense you scribbled into that HOA handbook. For a moment, Richard looked genuinely stunned. But then he rallied, puffing out his chest like some kind of bureaucratic peacock. "Well, Sheriff," he said with an emphasis so condescending it could have been bottled and sold as an energy drink for Karens. "Even you are not above HOA regulations." And that's when I knew this wasn't going to end with a handshake and an apology. "Let me get this straight," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "You're telling me that my legally registered vehicle, parked on my own driveway, is somehow a bigger issue than the fact that half the street doesn't bother shoveling their sidewalks in winter?" Richard's face turned an impressive shade of red. "This isn't about sidewalks. It's about maintaining standards." "Standards," I repeated with a laugh that probably sounded more unhinged than I intended. "Richard, your backyard shed is painted neon green." "That's different," he sputtered. "It's grandfathered in." At this point, my patience was hanging by a thread thinner than Richard's arguments. But before I could respond with something equally sarcastic, he pulled out his trump card. A bright orange tow notice. "If you don't move your truck within 24 hours, he announced triumphantly, "it will be towed at your expense." I stared at the notice like it was written in hieroglyphics. "You're kidding." "I assure you," Richard said with a smirk that made me want to arrest him on principle alone, "I am not. Now, let me tell you something about being a sheriff. You develop a pretty good poker face over time." But even I couldn't stop myself from laughing. A deep belly laugh that startled Richard so much he actually took a step back. "You think this is funny?" he snapped. "Oh no," I said between chuckles. "This is hilarious. Because here's the thing. Richard didn't know who he was messing with. Sure, he had his clipboard and his tow notices and his inflated sense of self-importance. But I had something far more powerful, an encyclopedic knowledge of local ordinances and just enough pettiness to make this personal. "Fine," I said finally, snatching the notice from his hand. "You want to play by the rules? Let's play by the rules." Richard looked momentarily confused but quickly recovered his smug demeanor. "Glad we could come to an understanding," he said before strutting off like he'd just won an Oscar for best performance in petty tyranny. As I watched him disappear down the street, clipboard swinging jauntily at his side, I couldn't help but smile. Because if there's one thing I've learned in all my years as sheriff, it's this. Sometimes justice isn't just about enforcing the law, it's about making sure people like Richard get exactly what they deserve. And trust me when I say this, Richard had no idea what was coming next. The next morning, I woke up to find not one, not two, but 3 HOA warning letters stuffed into my mailbox. 3. It was like Richard had gone home, brewed himself a pot of decaf rage, and decided to spend the entire evening drafting passive-aggressive love notes just for me. Each letter was printed on that obnoxiously official-looking HOA letterhead, the kind that makes you wonder if they're trying to run a neighborhood or a shadow government. The first letter reiterated the violation of my truck being parked in my driveway. The second one included a detailed breakdown of potential fines I could face if I didn't rectify the situation immediately. And the third was my favorite. It was a formal notice stating that my non-compliance could result in legal action. Legal action. Over a truck. I mean, come on. This is America. If there's one thing we should all agree on, it's that a man has a God-given right to park his truck on his own driveway. But apparently, Richard and his HOA cronies didn't get that memo. Now, I'm not one to back down from a fight, especially not when it involves someone trying to tell me what to do on my own property. So, I grabbed a cup of coffee, black, because this was war, sat down at my kitchen table, and started reading through every single page of the HOA bylaws. And let me tell you something. Those bylaws are insane. For starters, there's an entire section dedicated to what types of flowers are acceptable for front yard landscaping. Roses? Sure. Marigolds? Absolutely not. There's also a rule about how long your holiday decorations can stay up. No more than 14 days after the holiday itself. Which means if you leave your Christmas lights up until New Year's, you're technically a criminal in Richard's eyes. But the piece de resistance was Section 14B, the infamous rule about vehicles. According to the bylaws, all vehicles must be parked in garages unless they are actively in use. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sure my truck is actively in use when it's sitting in my driveway waiting for me to drive it. What do they expect me to do? Keep it running 24/7 like some kind of vehicular hamster wheel? The whole thing was ridiculous. Still, I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing anything. So, I called up my buddy Mike. He's a lawyer and one of the few people who actually enjoys reading legal documents for fun. "Mike," I said when he picked up the phone, "I need you to take a look at something for me." "What is it this time?" he asked with a sigh that suggested he already knew this was going to be ridiculous. "HOA bylaws," I replied. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Jack," he said finally, "you know I charge by the hour, right? Put it on my tab," I told him. "This is important." So Mike agreed to take a look at the bylaws while I went about my day, which mostly involved glaring at Richard every time he walked past my house with his clipboard of doom. By the time Mike called me back that evening, I was ready for some good news. "All right," he said as soon as I answered. "I've got two things for you. Good news and bad news." "Hit me with the bad news first," I said. "The bad news is that technically, the HOA does have the authority to enforce these rules," Mike explained. "But, and this is important, they can only enforce them if they're applied consistently across the board." I frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," Mike said with just a hint of amusement in his voice, "if they're going after you for parking your truck in your driveway, they need to go after everyone else who's doing the same thing." Now that got my attention. "So you're telling me," I said slowly, "that if Richard isn't enforcing this rule equally across all residents, then he's breaking his own bylaws?" "Exactly," Mike confirmed. "And if you can prove selective enforcement, you could have grounds for a legal complaint against the HOA." I hung up feeling more energized than I had in weeks. Because here's the thing. Richard might have had his clipboard and his tow notices and his army of HOA minions, but now I had something even better: leverage. The next morning, armed with nothing but a notebook and an unhealthy amount of caffeine coursing through my veins, I set out on a mission. My goal? To document every single vehicle parked in every single driveway in our neighborhood. And let me tell you, it didn't take long to find some serious violations. There was Mr. Thompson's RV parked halfway across his lawn like he'd just returned from Burning Man. There was Mrs. Carter's ancient station wagon that hadn't moved since Obama's first term. And then there was Richard himself, oh yes, whose teenage son had apparently decided that parking his beat-up Honda Civic diagonally across their driveway was perfectly acceptable. By noon, my notebook was filled with enough evidence to make even Perry Mason proud. That afternoon, I sent an email to Richard and CC'd every single member of the HOA board. "Dear Richard, I hope this email finds you well. As per your recent correspondence regarding my alleged violation of Section 14B of the HOA bylaws, I wanted to bring to your attention several other potential violations within our community. See attached photos. Given your commitment to maintaining aesthetic harmony, I trust that these issues will be addressed with the same urgency as mine. Looking forward to your response. Best regards, Sheriff Jack." Within minutes of hitting send, my phone started blowing up with messages from neighbors who had clearly received copies of my email. Most were supportive, some even downright gleeful, but one stood out. A text from Richard himself. "We need to talk," it read. "Oh yes, Richard. We certainly do." The email I sent to Richard and the HOA board was like tossing a grenade into a hornet's nest. Within an hour, my inbox was flooded with replies. Most were from neighbors who had clearly been waiting for someone to stand up to Richard's reign of terror. Messages ranged from, "Thank you for saying what we've all been thinking," to, "Can we nominate you for HOA president?" But the one that really caught my eye was from Richard himself. It was short, curt, and oozing with barely contained rage. "We need to meet. Immediately. Oh Richard, you poor, deluded man." I agreed to meet him at the HOA office, a glorified broom closet in the neighborhood clubhouse that smelled faintly of mildew and shattered dreams. When I arrived, Richard was already there, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. His clipboard was clutched tightly in one hand, and his face was set in a grimace so severe it looked like he'd just bitten into a lemon. "Jack," he began. his voice strained but still clinging to that air of superiority he always carried around like a bad cologne. "This stunt you pulled with the email." "Stunt?" I interrupted, feigning innocence. "You mean the part where I pointed out that you're selectively enforcing HOA rules? Or the part where I included photographic evidence?" Richard's eye twitched. "This is not how we handle things in this community." "Oh, I'm sorry," I said, leaning back in my chair. "How do we handle things? By sending threatening letters and slapping tow notices on people's vehicles without bothering to enforce the same rules on everyone else." For a moment, Richard didn't respond. He just stood there, gripping his clipboard like it was the only thing keeping him from lunging across the table at me. Finally, he took a deep breath and said, "Jack, this isn't personal." I raised an eyebrow. "Isn't it? Because it sure feels personal when you're singling me out while half the neighborhood is breaking the same rule." Richard opened his mouth to argue but quickly shut it again when I pulled out my notebook, the same one I'd used to document every driveway violation in the neighborhood. "Let's take a little stroll down memory lane, shall we?" I said, flipping through the pages. Here we have Mr. Thompson's RV parked halfway onto his lawn, violation of Section 14B and Section 9C, about maintaining landscaping aesthetics. Then there's Mrs. Carter's station wagon that hasn't moved since Obama was in office. And oh, what's this? I paused dramatically before turning the notebook around to show Richard a photo of his own driveway. "Your son's Honda Civic parked diagonally across two spaces? TSK, TSK. Richard's face turned a shade of red that could only be described as volcanic. "This is ridiculous," he sputtered. "You're blowing this out of proportion." "Am I?" I asked, leaning forward. "Because according to your own bylaws, which I've read thoroughly, selective enforcement is grounds for legal action against the HOA." That shut him up real quick. For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the ancient air conditioning unit struggling valiantly against its own obsolescence. Finally, Richard sat down across from me and folded his hands on the table. "What do you want?" he asked through gritted teeth. I smiled. "Oh, it's simple really. First, you're going to rescind all warnings and fines related to my truck. Second, you're going to issue an apology, publicly, to every resident who's been unfairly targeted by your so-called enforcement efforts." "And if I don't?" Richard asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "If you don't," I said with a shrug, "I'll file a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office for discriminatory enforcement practices under HOA law." I let that sink in for a moment before adding, "Oh, and I might also mention your little habit of using HOA funds to buy those fancy catered lunches for board meetings." Richard's jaw dropped. "How did you?" "Let's just say," I interrupted with a smirk, "you're not as good at covering your tracks as you think." The look on Richard's face was priceless. A mix of shock, outrage, and just a hint of fear. He knew he was cornered. "Fine," he muttered after what felt like an eternity. "I'll rescind the warnings and issue an apology. Publicly," I reminded him. "Publicly," he repeated through clenched teeth. Satisfied, I stood up and extended my hand across the table. "Pleasure doing business with you." Richard stared at my hand like it was covered in poison but eventually shook it anyway. As I walked out of that mildew-scented broom closet turned office, I couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. Not just for myself but for every poor soul who'd ever been bullied by an overzealous HOA board member drunk on their own power. Later that week, true to his word, or maybe just terrified of what else I might dig up, Richard sent out an email to all residents apologizing for any inconsistencies in rule enforcement and promising to do better moving forward. He even included a line about how much he appreciated feedback from community members, a line so insincere it practically dripped off the screen. But my favorite part? The very next day, Richard's son moved his Honda Civic into their garage. Victory had never tasted so sweet. The week after Richard's public apology was the most peaceful one I'd had in years. My truck sat proudly in my driveway, basking in its newfound freedom like a dog let off its leash. Neighbors waved at me with a new sense of camaraderie, and I even caught Mrs. Henderson sneaking a thumbs up while she watered her daisies. Yes, the same daisies Richard had once declared unauthorized flora. For a brief, shining moment, it felt like the neighborhood had finally returned to normal. But of course, peace in an HOA is about as stable as a Jenga tower in an earthquake. It didn't take long for Richard to regroup and come back swinging. Started on a quiet Tuesday morning. I was sipping my coffee and reading the local paper when I noticed a commotion outside. A tow truck was parked at the end of my driveway, its engine rumbling like it was ready to pounce. Standing next to it, clipboard in hand and smugness restored to full capacity, was none other than Richard. I stepped outside, coffee mug still in hand, and called out, "Morning, Richard. What's all this?" He turned to me with a grin so wide it looked like it hurt. "Good morning, Jack," he said, his voice dripping with fake cheerfulness. "I'm here to enforce Section 14B. I raised an eyebrow. "You mean the same Section 14B you apologized for selectively enforcing last week?" Richard's grin faltered for just a second before snapping back into place. "We've decided to take a stricter approach moving forward," he explained. "No exceptions." I glanced at the tow truck driver, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "And you're towing my truck because?" "Because," Richard said triumphantly, "it's been parked in your driveway for more than 48 hours without being moved. Now, let me pause here for a second to explain something about my truck. It's not just any truck. It's my work vehicle. As sheriff, I use it daily to patrol the county, respond to emergencies, and occasionally chase down the odd runaway goat. Don't ask." The idea that it had been sitting idle for 48 hours was laughable. "Richard," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice calm, "are you seriously trying to tow my work vehicle?" "It's not personal," he replied with that same infuriating shrug he always used when he knew he was being unreasonable. "Oh, it's personal," I shot back. "And you know it." By now, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, drawn by the spectacle of HOA drama unfolding in real time. Mrs. Carter was there with her ever-present cup of tea, and Mr. Thompson had even brought out a lawn chair like he was settling in for dinner theater. "Jack," Richard said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "rules are rules." "Funny you should say that," I replied, setting my coffee mug down on the hood of my truck. "Because as sheriff, I happen to know a thing or two about rules." Richard's grin wavered again. "For example," I continued, pulling out my phone and opening up a document I'd saved just for this occasion. "Did you know that under state law, towing a vehicle without proper notice is considered illegal?" Richard blinked. "What are you talking about?" "You were given notice." "Was I?" I asked innocently. "Because according to Section 22658 of the California Vehicle Code," yes, I looked it up, HOAs are required to provide written notice at least 96 hours before towing any vehicle from private property. The crowd murmured appreciatively as I turned my phone around to show Richard the relevant section of the law. "And let me guess," I added with a smirk, "you didn't bother to check state law before calling this tow truck?" Richard opened his mouth to argue but quickly closed it again when the tow truck driver chimed in. "He's right," the driver said reluctantly. "We can't tow without proper notice." The look on Richard's face was priceless. A mix of frustration, embarrassment, and sheer disbelief that his plan had backfired so spectacularly. "Fine," he snapped after a long pause. "But this isn't over." "Oh, I think it is," I said with a smile as the tow truck rumbled away down the street. The crowd erupted into applause as Richard stormed off toward his house like a toddler denied dessert. Mrs. Carter raised her teacup in salute, and Mr. Thompson gave me an approving nod from his lawn chair. But here's the thing about people like Richard, they don't know when to quit. The very next day, I received yet another letter from the HOA claiming that my truck violated Section 8D, prohibited commercial vehicles. According to Richard's latest interpretation of the bylaws, any vehicle used for work purposes, including mine, was considered commercial and therefore banned from being parked in residential driveways. Now this was just getting ridiculous. I decided it was time to bring out the big guns, figuratively speaking, of course. So I called up Mike again. "Mike," I said when he answered, "we've got another situation." "What now?" he asked with a weary sigh. I explained Richard's latest stunt and could practically hear Mike rolling his eyes through the phone. Jack, he said after a moment of silence, do you want me to handle this legally or creatively? Why not both? I replied with a grin. The next day, Mike sent an official cease and desist letter to the HOA on my behalf outlining every single legal violation they'd committed over the past month, from selective enforcement to illegal towing attempts, and threatening legal action if they didn't back off immediately. But that wasn't all. Mike also included a request for mediation through our county's dispute resolution program, a move that would force Richard and the HOA board into a room with me and an impartial mediator to hash out our differences once and for all. When Richard received the letter later that week, he looked like someone had just told him Christmas was canceled indefinitely. And honestly, that alone made all of this worth it. The day of the mediation was one for the history books, or at least for the neighborhood gossip circuit. I walked into the county's dispute resolution office feeling like I was about to step into a boxing ring. Richard was already there, sitting at the far end of the room with his clipboard clutched tightly in his lap like it was some kind of emotional support animal. He didn't look up when I entered, but I could see his jaw clenching so hard it was a wonder he hadn't cracked a tooth. The mediator, a calm and collected woman named Linda, greeted us with a warm smile that screamed, "I've seen worse." She ushered us into a small conference room with neutral beige walls and an air of forced civility. On the table were 2 glasses of water and a stack of paperwork that looked like it had been printed during the Clinton administration. "Thank you both for coming," Linda began, her voice soothing enough to make you forget you were about to argue over something as petty as driveway parking. "We're here today to resolve a dispute between Mr. Jack, the sheriff, and Mr. Richard, representing the HOA. Richard finally looked up at me, his expression somewhere between annoyance and outright disdain. "It's not personal," he muttered under his breath. "Oh, it's personal," I shot back, earning myself a warning glance from Linda. "Let's start with the issue at hand," Linda continued diplomatically. "Mr. Jack, can you explain your concerns?" I leaned back in my chair and folded my arms. "Sure thing. My concern is that Richard here has been selectively enforcing HOA rules to target me and my truck while ignoring similar violations from other residents." Richard scoffed loudly but didn't say anything. "And," I added, "he attempted to tow my vehicle without proper notice, which is not only against HOA bylaws but also illegal under state law." Linda nodded thoughtfully before turning to Richard. "Mr. Richard, do you have a response?" Richard cleared his throat and sat up straighter, clearly ready to deliver what he thought would be a knockout argument. "The HOA's goal is to maintain the aesthetic harmony of our community," he began in that pompous tone he always used when he thought he was being profound. "Mr. Jack's truck is disruptive to that harmony." Linda raised an eyebrow. "Disruptive how?" "It's large," Richard said after a pause, as if that explained everything. I couldn't help but laugh. "Large? That's your argument?" "It's a truck, Richard. What did you expect? A smart car." Linda held up a hand to stop me before turning back to Richard. "Mr. Richard, are there other vehicles in the neighborhood that could also be considered disruptive under this definition?" Richard hesitated for just a moment too long before replying, "That's not relevant." "Oh, it's very relevant," Linda countered firmly. "Selective enforcement is a serious issue and could open the HOA up to legal liability." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat but didn't respond. "Furthermore," Linda continued, flipping through her stack of paperwork like she was about to deliver a verdict on national television, "I've reviewed the HOA bylaws and state regulations provided by Mr. Jack's attorney. Thank you for sending those over, and it appears that towing without proper